Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we're doing another installment of the weekly meta breakdown where we look at the top performing decks on the MTG Arena ladder. We are going to be focusing this video on the historic best of one format. We'll try to cover best of three provided there's data this week, as well as if you're looking for standard, explorer, alchemy, special events, check out the playlist. We try to cover each format once a week to give you a mix of what the top decks are. So this data is coming from Untapped.gg, what you see on the screen. It's a companion tool that runs alongside Arena's client, aggregates your win rate, puts it in with other users' data, and gives us a whole bunch of cool stats that we can look at and what we're going to talk about today. The link is in the video description if you want to get started. Let them know that I sent you there. I'll paste all these deck lists, timestamp them. Everything's there to get going. So we're going to start it off as we always do by looking at popularity of the day. Just seeing what decks are being played the most, not necessarily winning the most. So win rates and play rates aren't necessarily correlated one-to-one. Sometimes it's an availability of wild cards. Sometimes it's just, this deck's fun to play where these decks aren't, or it's complicated, whatever it may be. So that's kind of where we want to see. So if you're building decks from scratch and you want to attack the meta, this is a good way to see what you can expect to play against when you're going into it. So we will jump in. Quick note, we see in the bottom left-hand corner, we're trying to hit 10,000 subs on the channel, trying to do it by the end of August. We're at 9,736, so less than 300 subs away from 10,000. Free, easy, click the button, helps out the channel, helps with the YouTube algorithms, so greatly appreciated if you can. So, ignore the date, this is just like the last meta shift when Lord of the Rings came out. We're going to look Platinum to Mythic rank, and we are going to look at popularity of the day. So Izzet Wizards is the most popular deck. It's been the most popular deck for the last few weeks. It's a very explosive deck. It's the deck that I got to number 62 Mythic with this month as well. Following up with Rakdos Midrange. I actually think the Rakdos Midrange decks aren't really well positioned right now in the meta. The win rates aren't necessarily there aggregated over like the last week or so. They suffer a lot against the Dimir, like the various Dredge decks, and the Dredge decks tend to be popular. We're not seeing as much Dredge really at all this week, kind of in the top placements. However, from like what I saw on the ladder when I was ranking, Dredge was probably like one every 3, 1 every 4 matches. People really like that deck. Temur Gates, another deck that's seeing a lot of gameplay, but it's got like low 50% win rate. Mono Black Control, Mono Green Elves, these usually see quite a bit of play, like the Elves deck, Squirrel Twin Life Gain combo. Both are fairly low in terms of the 50% win rate threshold. Golgari Yawgmoth seeing a low percentage. This is probably, at least in best of 3, the best deck in the format. It's pretty much a port of the modern deck. Infinite combo with a lot of grind value, very strong deck. And then we have Dimir Control, kind of winding it up. We look at the percentages themselves. We see Izzet Wizards being as high as 16% of the meta. And then we've kind of seen it progress lower, kind of peaked at the beginning of the month, and then it's kind of held steady around 10%. The deck that we've seen kind of drop in popularity is the Paradox Outcome deck. This is the colorless Storm deck. And then pretty much all the decks have been fairly static. We see Temur Gates pick up a bit in popularity, as well as the Rakdos Midrange deck somewhat hold around the 5%. It was as high as like 10% prior to the nerf of Crucius. I think the combination of the nerf to Crucius becoming weaker to Bowmaster, as well as just Dredge going wide, if you do want to play the Rakdos deck, you need to reconfigure it and play Brotherhood's End. You can't 1-for-1 removal when your opponents are getting back a bunch of stuff from the graveyard. Rakdos deck was my favorite deck. I played it a lot. I had a really high win rate with it, and I just don't think it's as effective post-ban. So jumping in, we're going to do August 6th through the 13th, Platinum to Mythic rank, 51,000 games of Magic played. Top win rate deck wasn't even on the radars, Boros Thopters. So this deck got a new card in the Explorer Anthology in Shrapnel Blast. So this lets you, for 2 mana, sacrifice any artifact and deal 5 damage to any creature or player. So notably not planeswalkers, so if your opponent has something like a Teferi, you can't direct the damage there. Sometimes these like sack effects, like Improvised Club, may do to any target, whereas in this case, it is specific to player or creature. So just keep that in mind as you're kind of playing out your turns. But one of the pillars of the format is these Retrofit or Foundry decks. So the Retrofitter Foundry through the last mode lets you sack a Thopter to create a 4/4 colorless construct. And the thing you're trying to do with this is sack an Ornithopter, sack the Thopter that gets made from Barb Spike or from Mashiko, or from, Yotai, and then you kind of get those free values. The deck has like Esper Sentinel, so this deck's got hit a bit with just the presence of Bowmaster. A lot of the powerful cards, like Esper Sentinel, now just get invalidated in a way by the existence of the Bowmasters themselves. But draw cards against Izzet and stuff like that. Removal, lifelink, and trample for a big threat. Toolcraft Exemplar is a creature that gets bigger with more artifacts you control. It is a little bit weaker into the Bowmaster meta. Genius Smith, another card that you have an opportunity to outscale it, but there's a turn sequence potentially where it can be picked off. But this provides you some card advantage, could find you a lot of the various effect spells in the deck. And then you have Mashiko, which can be used as removal, another buff effect, and then Mashiko's, that's also a buff. Mashiko's plus Shadow Sphere is a big value because you can give like a bunch of power, plus then you can also give trample and lifelink. The one thing with this deck is we did get the Horizon lands in the recent set. So you can do, I think it's like Sunscorched Canyon. So it's a pain land that lets you draw cards. So I'd consider maybe some copies of that in the deck. You can probably go down to 1 Plains, play 2 copies of that. The Citadel is beneficial in this deck because you can animate it with like Yotai, and then it increases the artifact count of your deck. So that's the Boros Thopters deck. We then go to Dimir Ninjas. It's a very fun deck, but it's a bit tricky to play. Not hard, but it's like a tempo deck. There's a very low threshold in terms of like screwing up the deck. So 64% win rate. And this deck is a really good example of Alchemy actually buffing things and making them playable. So Thousand Face Ninja is a card that's not playable in the regular set. So it's 4 mana to ninjutsu, 2 and 2 blue, where in this format it's 2 blue, 2 and a blue. And the combination, so if you have a silver for out and attacking, you have 2,000 Face Ninjas in hand, you can kind of cycle them back and forth multiple times and then ninjutsu them off each other, and then copy the silver for master and then make a lot of lords and kind of pump out and do big amounts of damage out of nowhere with the deck. I have a video of this on my YouTube if you want to see it in action. The first match we popped off and it was awesome, but it was a deck that like sequencing and stuff plays a major effect. This deck is a deck that can take advantage of the Bowmasters in a kind of proactive way. It gives you 2 bodies, so you can ninjutsu them. You could also like recycle your Bowmaster at times by like ninjutsuing it back to hand. Moon Circuit draws you cards. Silver Fur is a lord and it reduces the activated abilities of your other ninjutsus. There's a few different layers here in terms of cards. So you'll notice the Retrofitter Foundry package. You have Changeling Outcast. So this card here is a Thopter. It's a ninja. And notably, the thing that I always forget, it's also an army. So if you have the Changeling Outcast out and Bowmaster comes in, the counter goes on the Changeling Outcast. You don't create another instance of an army because an army looks to see if there's the first copy. So keep that in mind. Sometimes you can pump it out and get damage that way, especially with Unblockable. It has a lot of utility. But at times, if you're anticipating to have that extra blocker, that extra creature, it's something to just be mindful of. Spell Pierce for disruption, Fatal Push for removal, and then Fairy Seer, while neither a ninja, Thopter, or army, it does provide a nice evasive body that you can return to hand and then set up your feature draws with the Scry 2. Then move to Izzet Wizards. So this list here has got 62% win rate. I don't think this is the optimal list. I had 76% win rate. I had at one point close to 80%. I think the combination, so the Birthday Escape, Rangers, Firebrand, I don't think are better than the instant speed versions. The instant speed versions lets you play kind of a tempo-oriented game, which you want. You can pass this to your opponent's turn. You can kill stuff on their turn. You can disrupt combos, things like if you run into life gain or stuff like that. You can set up the Scry, which is more important. And the thing is, the Ring Tempts You in Historic is actually a negative value. There's a lot of ways to just kill. Like the upside is your Dreadhorde Arcanist technically is unblockable upon attack in certain times, but you generally want to pump your Dreadhorde Arcanist in terms of power anyways, because you want to flashback stuff, so you lose that ability. the draw discard against a lot of Bowmasters or Shieldreds is actually more painful than beneficial in some cases. So I usually prefer the instant speed. The deck itself is the same otherwise. So for context, I am playing both Play with Fire and Consider in lieu of the Lord of the Rings cards. But the deck is really just kind of Spellslinger, pump up your stuff using Balmor and Symmetry Sage, letting Dreadhorde Arcanist flash back a bunch of stuff, and then you could just play back a bunch of burn, the Wizard's Lightning and Static Discharge, as well as Flame of Anord. That's really useful in this deck. Kill a Shelly, draw some cards, blow up artifacts, doubling it up if you have a wizard. This deck is playing Fiery Izzet. So Islet, Izzet. So I was on 3. This one's on 4. I think 3 is probably fine, and I'll explain why. This deck requires you to pay a life. Or so this mana source requires you to pay a life regardless of activating. It's not like a typical pain land where you can tap for colorless. This deck is very mana intensive in terms of you don't play many lands, but you are going to be tapping them pretty much every turn and using your mana pretty much every single turn cycle. The added damage turn of return is quite impactful. Most of the time, I think in like 40 plus games that I played with the deck, there's only one game where I drew 2 cards from the lands. So, and those are usually the longer games. Those longer games usually have access to something like a Shieldred, so the draw actually hurts you similarly. The format's very worked around Bowmaster, so be mindful of that. This version's on like 2 dens. I'll place both lists if you want to kind of play both and see where you want to be, but I like the Wizards deck in this configuration. The Ninjas deck, I had a high win rate. The Rakdos deck, like I said, I was very high win rate, but I was actually higher than this at a point. But like 5 and 5 is not good enough to kind of rank up. Tried a bunch of different configurations, was trying it in best of 3 as well, but I think you can see this is version 12 of the deck, but I had like a crazy win rate at one point with this deck, like 13-2. I was fairly high, but kind of normalized after that. You can see like 20-6 overall, and then we kind of fall 9-5. Like I think if you're really wanting to try to push like the upper bounds of rank, I don't think the Rakdos deck is the best right now. We'll then go to Golgari Yawgmoth. So this is a deck that I think is actually going to have a higher win rate than actually provided because it's a harder to play deck. But this is a infinite combo deck. So Yawgmoth and 2 Young Wolves lets you sacrifice, target the other to put the -1/1 counter that resets the Undying. So you can effectively loop the 2 Young Wolves dying. You pair that with a drain effect like Zulaport Cutthroat. You could drain your opponent out of the game. The life gain of Prosperous Innkeeper offsets the life loss of Yawgmoth. Similarly, Shieldred provides that same utility. So you can basically deal damage to your opponent equal to the number of cards in your library because Yawgmoth has a condition that you have to draw a card. It's not just a natural sack effective ability. This deck can find any of your key pieces with Chord of Calling or Eldritch Evolution that helps you kind of find there. Apatra as well as Young Wolf allows you to create snake tokens that also provides a utility in terms of the pseudo-infinite combo. You have Haywire Might as a tutorable effect to destroy opponents' One Rings, artifacts, enchantments. Delighted Halfling helps you ramp in terms of finding your Yawgmoths and stuff like that, as well as making it uncounterable. You'll notice 4 Kalani Gardens in the mana base. This creates more creatures that you can sack to get utility in that respect. This is another deck playing some number of the Horizon lands to draw you cards, but this deck is very hard to... it is quite hard to play effectively, I would say. I was probably... I played a couple best of 3 games, and I used at least 5 to 10 more minutes of clock than my opponent, just trying to go through the loops and stuff like that, trying to figure out the lines. But I think it's a deck that the more you play, the more you get efficient with it. It is a very high ceiling deck. We then move to Grixis Midrange. So interesting kind of evolution of the deck into Historic. We've seen versions of this deck in Alchemy in the past. The Axis of Blue gives us Agent Rafine, which was kind of a standout in Alchemy recently. So in kind of grindy mid-range matchups, the Rafine lets us just sit there and then steal cards from your opponent's library. I don't think Mind Spike is... you're better off playing Thoughtseize. This version's also on Go for the Throat. This is actually, I'm just assuming someone playing an Alchemy deck in Historic. We look at the mana base, there's no Shockland. I'm just going to cut this out. Grixis, it's winning a bit in terms of alchemy decks. If you want to keep it, I'll paste the deck list for you, but I don't want to really focus too much like on an alchemy deck. This isn't an optimized list. There should be fatal pushes, there should be thought seizes, the mana base should be completely revised in terms of not having pain lands when you have access to shock lands. Forsaken Crossroads, not great in a 3-color deck when you have access to better duels and stuff like that. But you can kind of get an idea here. If you're looking for an alchemy deck, here you go. We'll then look at, so mono green was showing up here. I don't know why it's not showing the percentage, but mono green was at 58% for this devotion list. And it is using, you'll notice, the addition of Armored Scrap Gorger. This incidentally can have Graveyard Hate, which is nice. You're pairing that with the Elvish Mystics, which do see a bit of a reduction in terms of utility because they do get picked off by the Bowmasters. The Invasion of Ixalan, the tech that came over from Explore, because we don't have Oath of Nissa, but the core of the deck is a Nykthos ramp deck that you're trying to use Kiora to tap and untap. This version of the deck has access to Leyline of Abundance, so this card is banned in the other formats, and the Leyline allows your mana dorks to tap for an additional mana. So this could generate you a whole bunch of mana. It's also very powerful mana sink late game. You also have access to the One Ring in this deck to draw you a bunch of cards. So this is something that usually mono green can run out of gas. You know, they have all this mana, but they don't have cards to play. Karn, access to a Karn board, Cavalier of Thorns, Storm the Festival on the top end, and a single copy of Silverback Elder. This card can gain you life, blow up artifacts or enchantments, ramp you. So kind of a bunch of utility in that respect. The options for this sideboard: Stone Brain for combo hate, Pestilence Cauldron to rebuy you stuff from your graveyard, the Aether Flux Reservoir lets you gain a bunch of life by casting a bunch of spells, Perilous Vault in this version. So I actually don't necessarily think I would want Perilous Vault. I think there's better options. You can go Karn Silex, you could go Filigree, if you want an effect to have a sweeper. I think Karn Silex. So notably, the thing is, this exiles, which makes it worse. So it's more to activate. You have to pay 4 mana plus then another 5 to activate. The Karn Silex is 3. You can untap with Kiora. This exiles, so it doesn't even cause, like in the event, like your Cavalier dies, you don't get the trigger from there. This gets rid of your Leyline. Oftentimes you want this for creatures. So I wouldn't play this. I'd play Karn Silex instead. One Ring, Cityscape Leveler, Portal to Phyrexia, all on the top end. The one card I would probably say, get rid of the Aether Flux Reservoir, play the Might instead. And I think this just make it Karn Silex, and it's a reasonable Karn board here. You might also just want this to be Pithing Needle as another option to play in that case. We'll then go to Izzet Belcher, so 58%. So this is a combo deck built around Goblin Charbelcher. So Belcher reveals cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land. You'll notice with this deck, there is no lands, but there's lands. And that's because you are playing a number of the module dual face cards in Shatterskull Smashing, like Song Mad Treachery, Seagate. So this version here, you'll also notice creativity. You can make tokens that are treasure tokens with like Magma Opus or Prismari Command. Creativity, the Goblin Charbelcher is the only artifact in your deck. So you always find it and you can activate it. If you can cast Ironcrag Feet, generates you exactly 7 mana. That lets you cast the Goblin Charbelcher and activate it that turn. Notably, there is the clause here that you can only cast 1 more spell per turn. So if you do this, cast the Belcher, your opponent tries to counter it, and you try to Pact of Negation, you cannot Pact of Negation. So something to just keep in mind. This version's on an offer you can't refuse as a cheap interactive spell, as well as March of Reckless Joy that lets you just get rid of some like extra lands late game or just like other effects to dig to try to find your copy of Belcher. So a lot of this deck is just revolved around trying to find your Belchers themselves. You then go to Grixis Dredge. So we've seen a variety of different color orientations for these Dredge decks. We've seen Sultai, we've seen Dimir, and now we're seeing Grixis. So access to Grixis gives you Faithless Looting that helps you get rid of the cards you don't want in your hand. So a big thing is like when you keep hands with like Silver Smoke Ghoul or Prized Amalgam, or even the Wonder, you'd much rather have these cards in your graveyard. Similarly with Bloodghast, you really want to get these in your graveyard to trigger to come back from the graveyard for free. Notably, a lot of these cards care about, so in the case of like Creeping Chill, you can't discard Creeping Chill to get the effect. It has to be put from your library into your graveyard. Similar with Narcomoeba. but kind of fixes your draws in that case. It's also a card you can mill over and then cast for the flashback later in the game. This does expose you a bit more to Bowmasters. You'll hear this over and over again. Bowmasters are very much a focal point of the format. While we don't see it like heavily in a lot of these decks, it is a card that's overarching and at the power level that you need to be mindful. It's seen a lot more in best of 3, but it is an effect there. Stitcher Supplier mills your graveyard, glimpse the unthinkable, target yourself. And the core of what you want to do is like self-mill yourself, flip over like prized amalgams, like Narcomoeba or Blood Gas coming back could trigger it. You gain the life from Creeping Chill and make Silver Smoot come back. Wonder in your graveyard with an island means all your creatures get flying, so a lot of value that way there. Then go to Azorius Auras, and this deck is going to be using things like Light Paws, as well as Core Spirit Dancer, a copy of Shram. We got the addition of Giver of Ruins now as another protection effect, which is very powerful. Notably, this also protects against colorless, so if your opponent has Cityscape Leveler, you can protect against that. This deck also has access to Invisible Stalker, 2-mana 1/1 hexproof, can't be blocked. So this, you could strap it up with a whole bunch of stuff, make it very formidable. You got Arcane Flight, so with Light Paws you can tutor up a bunch of 1-ofs, so, or like random auras when you cast them, so you'll notice a bunch of 1-ofs. So you have Arcane Flight for flying, Cartouche for an extra body and first strike, Combat Research for card advantage, Curious Obsession the same way, Glaring Aegis as a way to kind of get rid of a blocker, Griff's Bloom for flying, Sentinel's Eyes for vigilance, Aether Tunnel for unblockable, All That Glitters to pump up your team, similar with Ethereal Armor, and then Staggering Insight for lifelink and card advantage in the deck. This should be Lurrus Companion, Lurrus Companion. And then lastly, you'll probably see more of it than it's actually good, but this deck can win out of nowhere. This is the No Color Paradoxical Storm deck. If you don't own these cards, unless you really want to play the deck, there's a lot of cards in this deck that do not go into other decks. So if you want to use your wild cards, consider this a warning that you are using them at your own discretion. So the core of the deck, Cloud Key, as well as Semblance Anvil, make your artifacts cost 0 mana. What you're going to do is then with Mystic Forge and Paradox Engine, you can cast cards from the top of your library, untapping all your mana sources to then basically cast more spells. Forsaken Monument would gain you a bunch of life. Similarly, Aetherflux Reservoir. You have the One Ring to refill your hand, and then you have Karn to find your tutor board, but basically what you're going to do is cast a bunch of spells over and over and over and over, gain a bunch of life, eventually find your Aetherflux Reservoir, and shoot your opponent for 50 damage. Also has access to a Karn board, in which you can have Graveyard Hate, another Reservoir, the Ancestral Statue, basically through cost reduction, can cast itself infinite times, or with Paradox Engine, you bounce itself to its hand, so you just keep recasting it, gaining you infinite life. One Ring, you have another Monument, another Engine, and a Leveler. So all your combo pieces kind of in the graveyard, or in your sideboard as well, that you can tutor for. So that's it for the week. Let me know what you've been playing, what you've been liking, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching.